In some parts of Lincolnshire, the 17th century doesn't seem very far away. In Grantham, the town's most famous son is celebrated as a hero. And why not? After all, Isaac Newton is one of very few scientists that everyone has heard of. Today, his name is everywhere. Newton was born a few miles away in a countryside manor house, but he came here in 1655, at the age of 12, to attend the local grammar school.
We're standing in the original school building, which was built in the 16th century, completed in 1529. The room hasn't changed in its overall appearance a great deal since then. We've still got the original roof, but obviously, as you can see, looking around, the room is now used mostly as a library rather than as a classroom. Right, well, behind me you'll see the board showing all the headmasters of the King's School since it first started, way back to 1532, and you'll notice that halfway down that list, the name of Henry Stokes. He was the headmaster from 1650 to 1663, and it was he who actually taught Newton. Well, here we have an example of 18th century graffiti, I suppose you might call it. It was the common practice for boys in the 18th century, at least, as far as we know, when they left the school, to carve their names in the stonework of these windows. It may even have been a practice in the 17th century, because we do notice that one of the signatures here is one I. Newton. It looks fairly amateurish to me. Whether he actually was responsible for it or not, I can't tell you. But many people think that he did.
We don't know too much about Newton's school days, but we do know about a fight he had with the school bully, a fight that seemed to have a profound impact on Newton.
This fight took place in the churchyard, a mere 50 yards or so from the school. And apparently, up until the time when the fight took place, Newton hadn't been particularly bright boy. He was regarded as somewhat dull, not very interested in his schoolwork, certainly not top of the class. But then he was involved in this fight, and apparently he gave the bully a good hiding. Afterwards, he was transformed as a student, and he became extremely hard-working, immediately rose to the top of the class, and was the headmaster's favorite pupil.
At first, Newton's mother wasn't very keen on sending him to university. When her second husband died, she was hoping Isaac would look after the family estate. But Newton's mind was forever wandering from matters at hand. Finally, his mother accepted that he just wasn't cut out for life on the farm, and Newton went off to Cambridge. Today, Trinity College is a tourist attraction as well as a place of learning. But the buildings have changed little since Newton's day. His rooms were just to the right of the Great Eastern Gate. Later, he would build a laboratory next to the side of the chapel.
Newton is very much, certainly in the 1660s, when he's a student and then a fellow, a pretty self-directed individual. I mean, there's a sense in which he was self-directed for his entire life. No one, perhaps, has ever been more self-directed than Isaac Newton.
While he was in Trinity College, as a student and as a academic teacher, he had very few good relationships with his fellows. He was a loner.
Most of his work on alchemy and the secret properties of matter was only distributed in manuscript and known to very few of his colleagues. Some of his work he was very, very keen on publicizing. He wrote textbooks in geography, for example. He submitted papers to the Royal Society of London on the properties of light and color. He wanted those distributed everywhere, and he was not unenthusiastic about having them published. There were aspects of his work he was extremely keen should be known to almost nobody. He was a religious heretic. He denied the divinity of Christ. That was a criminal offense. He certainly didn't want that known to many people.
Newton's greatest insight would come not here at Cambridge, but back at the family home at Woolsthorpe. He spent about a year and a half there when an outbreak of the plague forced the university to shut down.
There's a famous story where he sits in the garden, apple falls down, and allegedly that led him to the discovery of the laws of gravitation. Now the modern version of that is that he was sort of gently falling asleep, opened his eyes, sees apple falling, next thing he sees is the moon. And the connection he makes in that context is that here is a special case of an apple falling down. That's a case of gravitation. The link he makes is to the moon, a vastly bigger object, which he thinks behaves in a similar way. From that, he works out what the moon does in the gravitational way, makes a prediction which he can test against known facts at the time, even at the time, and finds that the motion of the apple agrees with the motion of the moon on certain assumption that he makes. So that is a generalization that he makes. Many people could have done, they didn't, he did. That's the difference. He's the supreme problem solver.
After more than 35 years at Cambridge, it was time for a change. When Newton was offered the security of a government job in London, he took it. He became warden and later master of the Royal Mint, at that time housed within the Tower of London. He would eventually move into a house near Leicester Fields. The site is now a library, and the gardens have become Leicester Square. Newton's day-to-day work was now largely administrative, but science was still on his mind. So was establishing his name and his reputation. By the start of the 18th century, Newton was the most formidable scientist in Europe, dominating the so-called Republic of Letters of the day. His disputes with other men of learning were well known. The most impassioned fight of all was with Gottfried Leibniz over the invention of calculus.
He was very defensive, he was very aggressive. A very good example of this is his treatment of Leibniz and the Leibnizians in the 1710s and 20s towards the end of his life, when his politicking towards German and Swiss and French and Dutch allies of Leibniz, his chief enemy at that period, are extraordinary. He would review his own books, he would commission his friends to produce putatively objective reports of the state of affairs between himself and Leibniz. He was a dirty fighter, but he was not peculiarly dirty by the standards of the Republic of Letters at the time.
There's been a great deal of speculation on what was behind Newton's awkward and sometimes aggressive personality. Milo Keynes, a retired surgeon, believes long hours in the chemistry lab took their toll.
I believe he was poisoned by mercury in the 1690s and showed the symptoms of mercury poisoning.
Scientists have studied samples of Newton's hair and found high levels of mercury and other toxins. But Keynes says the effect was not permanent, and he says Newton was a sane man.
Although he was suspicious and slightly or even greatly paranoid, he just had a sensitive, prickly personality at the edge of normality, which could indeed tip over into a psychosis if he was emotionally upset.
By now, Newton's reputation was very secure. He had published the most influential scientific book ever written, the Principia. It would dominate the world of physics for 200 years. He would go on to publish another landmark text, the result of his painstaking experiments in optics. It was the first thorough investigation of light and color. One of Newton's greatest achievements was in his study of the solar system. He built on the work of Galileo and Kepler and found that the planets obey precise physical and mathematical laws.
This is a chart which was printed in the 1720s by one of London's most famous scientific publishers, John Senex. He also made science instruments. And he's a representative of this new group of men working in London in the early 18th century who make their living out of popularizing and publicizing Newton's new discoveries in natural philosophy and astronomy. What the chart shows, first of all, is the solar system. This is the orbit of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Earth and the Moon, Venus, Mercury, and there's the Sun in the middle. And then overlaid on that are the paths of all the comets then known which were periodic, in other words, comets which men reckoned would return. And then scattered around the chart are long quotations from Newton's writings, his writings on heat, chemistry, on optics, his writings on theology. Now, what's very striking about this is the way in which the passages are laid out. They're laid out in spherical shapes and put in heaven, as though Newton's texts were themselves sublime. Here are the words of Sir Isaac Newton, laid out in the shape of a sphere and put in heaven.
The kind of hero worship associated with Newton was unprecedented, and no scientist until Einstein would have as great an impact. But Newton's work still plays a vital role in today's science.
The guy who sits at NASA or somewhere, wherever they send up the satellites, the artificial satellites up into space, the laws upon which the orbits of these objects are worked out, those laws are the same laws that Newton put up some 300 years ago. So these are not archaic objects, some purely historical constructs. They are used every day. Every mechanical engineer working in the lab downstairs here uses Newton's laws.
When Newton died at the age of 85, he was given a state funeral and the ultimate British honor, burial in Westminster Abbey, alongside kings and queens, poets and priests.
And I think he would probably be perfectly satisfied with being treated as a genius, as a national hero, and as something close to divine. The very last paper, pound note, that Britain produced had Newton's picture on it, and I think he would have thought that that was rather appropriate.